Support for the Alan L. Edwards Psychology Lecture Series is provided by the University of Washington Alumni Association.
The Science of Psychology in the Real World. Made possible through an endowment from noted University of Washington professor Alan Edwards, whose half-century of research, teaching, and writing transformed psychological research. Tonight, part 2 of the new Science of Adolescence, featuring Temple University professor Laurence Steinberg.
Well, good evening. I'm Sherry Ms. Morey, Chair and Professor of Psychology here at the University of Washington, and I do have the distinct honor of welcoming you to our annual Edwards Public Lecture Series, and I'm pleased that you could join the department as we celebrate then the science of psychology in the real world. Now, before introducing this evening's lectures, let me just make a few comments about how this series came about. This truly exciting annual lecture series is a result of generous support from Professor Alan Edwards, who left a substantial gift, an endowment, in the department that ensures that this series will continue on to take place every year, free of charge to all of you, into perpetuity. Now, Professor Edwards was affiliated with our department for about half a century. He came here in 1944. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1994. He was known for being an outstanding teacher, researcher, and writer, and he's credited with changing the way that modern psychological research is carried out by introducing really the first sort of gold standards of statistics methods and techniques and books that were used in most undergraduate courses in statistics across the country at that time. Now, the Edwards family contribution to the psychology department is an example of what can be accomplished with the support from members of the community, such as each one of you in this room. And especially in these tough economic times, your support is greatly appreciated and is critical. And so I know some of you here, I recognize you as our contributors to our department. I just want to say thank you very much. Now, the psychology department seeks to take advantage of its unique collection of world-class researchers and instructors by facilitating the interactions between traditional subdisciplines within psychology. That is, for example, the developmental areas, the clinical areas, social areas, and so on. And so what we do now is we aim to foster a dynamic and vibrant synergy that leads to innovative solutions to large societal problems. So in fact, this year's focus on the science of psychology in the real world illustrates in different ways over this 3-week period the different ways that our department's unique type of interdisciplinary and comprehensive research programs accomplish this goal. And so tonight we focus on the new science of adolescence, understanding risky behavior, a research area that uses tools of innovative behavioral assessment with social, clinical, developmental, and neuroscience theories to understand why adolescents in particular make risky choices and what can be done to control those choices. Now, at this point, what I'd like to do is introduce our first speaker, Professor Larry Steinberg. Now, he received his AB degree in psychology from Vassar College and his PhD in human development and family studies from Cornell in 1977. Now, Dr. Steinberg is currently not only a professor of psychology at Temple University, but he also holds the Laura H. Carnell Professorship of Psychology position, and he is a distinguished university professor at Temple University. Now, he truly is one of the world's leading authorities on psychological development during adolescence. Dr. Steinberg's research has focused on a range of topics, including adolescent brain development, risk-taking and decision-making, mental health, family relationships, after-school employment, school achievement, and juvenile justice. His work has been funded by a variety of public and private organizations, including the National Institutes of Health, the U.S. Department of Education, the United States Department of Justice, and many foundations, including the MacArthur Foundation. Dr. Steinberg serves as a member of the National Academy's Board on Children's, Youth, and Families, and he currently chairs the Academy's Committee on the Science of Adolescence. He's been frequently a consultant to state and federal agencies and lawmakers on child labor, secondary education, and juvenile justice policy. And he has also provided expert testimony and consultation in a number of legal cases involving adolescent brain and behavioral development. So as a leader in this field, Dr. Steinberg has served as past president then of the Division of Developmental Psychology of the American Psychological Association, and he's a former president of the Society for Research on Adolescence. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association, as well as as well as the Association for Psychological Science. Now, he has many, many honors, many, many achievements, more than I should have time to list today. Many of these are lifetime achievement types of awards and teaching awards. At this point, I just want to say that it's a great honor to introduce to you our Edwards Lecture, our first Edwards Lectures for this evening, Dr. Larry Steinberg.
Thank you very much, Sherry, and thank you for inviting me to this terrific lecture series. And I'm happy to be sharing the stage with my friend Kevin King, who will speak after I'm finished. So I want to talk about adolescent risk-taking and what we're learning from the study of adolescent brain development that helps us understand why adolescence is a time of heightened engagement in risky and reckless behavior. Let me start by putting this in a public health context. Adolescence, generally speaking, is a very healthy time in the life cycle. There is not a great deal of illness or disease. And the major contributors to morbidity and mortality during adolescence are behavioral in nature. They're things that young people do to themselves and to others. So just some familiar examples of this. Compared to adults, adolescents commit more crimes. This is a figure that is known as the age crime curve, and it shows you that crime increases from pre-adolescence into adolescence, peaks at around age 18, and then declines after that. This is a very robust trend that you would find in virtually every industrialized country in the world, and it has been very stable over time in the United States as well, and it's true for all kinds of crimes. So here's a similar graph for property crime, showing the same peak in prevalence. Surprisingly, adolescents drown more often than people of other ages, which is amazing considering the fact that people that age typically are pretty strong and have a lot of endurance. So we think that this must be due to risky and reckless decisions that individuals of this age make when going into a body of water. Adolescents attempt suicide more often than people of other ages as well. Here are some data on non-fatal self-inflicted injuries, again showing a peak around the same age as the peak for drownings and the peak for violent and non-violent crime. So psychologists have been studying adolescent risk-taking for a very, very long time, and have developed a number of theories about why risk-taking increases into adolescence and then declines after. And there are a lot of myths that abound about why adolescent risk-taking is so much higher than it is in childhood or adulthood. So one popular belief is that adolescents are illogical, but it turns out that on measures of logical reasoning, individuals, by the time they're 15 or 16, are just as good as adults are in solving logical problems. Adolescents are not more illogical than adults. Some people believe that adolescents underestimate risk, but if you give people of different ages questionnaires, asking them how likely various risky things are to happen to them, adolescents tend to overestimate risk, just like we all do, but they overestimate it even more than adults do. So that can't account for why they take more risk than adults. Some people think that adolescents suffer from delusions of invulnerability. They do, but so do we, so do adults. And actually, there are no age differences in the extent to which people hold delusions of invulnerability. There had been for a while the suggestion that adolescents think poorly when making decisions. But studies of basic cognitive skills, information processing skills, show that by the time people are 15 or 16, they're just as good as they will be as adults. So that really can't account for this peak in risk-taking. And others have argued that, well, maybe adolescents are simply unaware of the dangers associated with risky behavior. They're not, and it's not surprising, I think, that they're not, given the amount of time and money we devote to teaching adolescents in school about different risk behaviors. But they engage in them anyway. So the question that has been driving our research for such a long time is, if adolescents are so smart, then why do they do such stupid things? So we have suggested an alternative view to the idea that adolescents engage in risky behavior because they have limited cognitive abilities. And instead, we think that heightened risk-taking during adolescence has nothing to do with cognitive deficits, and that it is due to differences between adolescents and adults in social and emotional capacities, not intellectual capacities. We also think that risk-taking in adolescence is normative. If you look at adolescents in other species, it may be surprising to some of you to thinking about adolescents in other species, but all mammals go through puberty. So we can look at something that is similar enough to adolescence in other species to see how similar it is to human behavior. And it turns out that in other species, adolescence is a time when the juveniles leave their natal environment. They leave the adults that have been protecting them, and they venture out into the wild in search of a mate, or maybe several mates. That's a very risky thing to do, because there are competitors out there and there are predators out there. And so it might be the case, we think, that we've been wired evolutionarily to be more willing to take risks during adolescence because it facilitates our reproduction. And it is in this sense that we would think of risk-taking during adolescence as evolutionarily adaptive. That is, it's a good thing that adolescents take risks, not a bad thing. It's just the question of how they take the risks and what risks they take that we should worry about. And it turns out that if you look at when it is that females are most likely to get pregnant and to bear the most number of children over time, that the age at peak fecundity, which refers to childbearing, the age at peak fecundity is about 5 years after menarche, which in modern industrialized society, menarche occurs around 12 or 12 and a half on average, so that this would be around 17 years old. And that's really similar to the age that I just showed you is the peak age for all kinds of risky behaviors. So this tells a very nice story, I think, about why risk-taking increases into adolescence, peaks in the late teen years, and then declines. Now, we've tried to understand this phenomenon by looking at brain development during adolescence and have advanced a dual systems model of adolescent risk-taking that looks at two different brain systems and how these systems change during the adolescent years. So one system that we've been interested in is what we call an incentive processing system of the brain. This is the part of the brain that we engage when we are evaluating and predicting potential rewards and punishments. And it's also the part of the brain that we engage when we process emotional and social information. And it's located mainly in an area of the limbic system referred to as the ventral striatum, and the connections between that area of the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, and in particular the sort of center area of the prefrontal cortex. What do we know about the development of this system during adolescence? It undergoes major changes in early adolescence and in mid-adolescence around the time of puberty. And we're now beginning to understand the role that pubertal hormones have, not simply on sexual development and on growth, physical growth, but on brain functioning as well. And some of these changes in this incentive processing system are due to the impact of sex hormones on the brain. And in particular, these sex hormones affect the way in which the brain uses the neurotransmitter dopamine. Most of you probably have heard of dopamine. Dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter for our experience of pleasure or reward. In fact, scientists sort of jokingly refer to what we call a dopamine squirt that you get when you're anticipating something pleasurable like sex or food or money. And there's an increase in dopamine activity in the brain in this incentive processing system shortly after puberty. And so this is, I think, the sad news of tonight's talk, which is that nothing for the rest of your life will ever feel as good as it did as when you were a young teenager. You do not have as much dopamine activity in your reward centers now, unless there's anybody in here who's 14 or 15 years old, as you did at that point in development. And what we see is that these changes in dopamine activity follow this pattern that looks like an upside-down U with age. So there's an increase in dopamine activity in this incentive processing system during the first part of adolescence. It peaks in mid-adolescence, and then it declines. And we believe that changes in dopamine activity in the brain lead to certain changes in behavior. They lead to increased attentiveness to rewards, because if things feel more rewarding, you're going to be looking for them more intensely. And this leads individuals to engage in a set of behaviors that psychologists refer to as sensation seeking. That is the pursuit of novel and exciting experiences in order to be rewarded. These changes also lead to an increase in emotional arousal and an increase in attentiveness to social information. And some of you who've been parents of teenagers or who are parents of teenagers probably can appreciate how much adolescents care about what other people are thinking about them. And we now understand that this increase in this attentiveness to social information has this neural basis that has been increasingly well mapped out. Now, our model is a dual systems model. So I've first discussed the incentive processing system. The other system is what we refer to as a cognitive control system. And this is the system of the brain that's associated with higher order intellectual abilities, things involving working memory, logical reasoning, planning, and regulating impulses. And this system is localized mainly in the lateral areas of the prefrontal cortex, so the parts of your brain on the sides of your forehead, back to your temples. Now, this system also changes during adolescence, but it follows a different timetable than the incentive processing system. So the cognitive control system develops gradually from pre-adolescence on, and it continues well into the mid-20s. And this system's change is largely independent of puberty. We have mapped out the changes in brain anatomy and function that are related to these changes in the cognitive control system. For those of you familiar with neuroscience, the changes are manifested in synaptic pruning in this part of the brain, as well as myelination in this part of the brain. And those are two underlying brain processes that make the brain function more efficiently and permit the faster transmission of information across neural circuits. And these changes in the cognitive control system also have behavioral manifestations. They lead to better impulse control and the better coordination of emotion and cognition, and to more foresight and planning ahead. And again, those of you who have raised or work with adolescents know that as young people mature, they become much better at these things. They become better at thinking ahead, of anticipating the consequences of their behaviors. But if there's one message from my lecture tonight, it's that the different timetables of these systems are hugely important in understanding adolescent risk-taking. Because this arousal of the incentive processing system occurs early in adolescence, around the time of puberty. But the maturation of the cognitive control system is gradual, and it's not complete until late adolescence or early adulthood. And so one metaphor that we use to describe this is that the accelerator is activated before a good braking system is in place. So I'm going to tell you about some studies that we've done on this, but let me just pause here and summarize the theoretical background and offer some hypotheses about what we expect to find. Reward seeking and self-regulation are governed by different brain systems, and they develop along different timetables during adolescence. And there is a maturational imbalance in the development of these systems, which makes middle adolescence, let's say roughly from 14 to 17, an especially vulnerable period for risky behavior, because that's when the accelerator is pressed down to the floor before there is a good braking system in place. And I'm going to show you some evidence that this vulnerability, this maturational imbalance, is made even larger by the presence of peers, because peers are so important during adolescence that they add extra activation to the incentive processing system. So when we think about incentives and rewards, we shouldn't just think about physical rewards and incentives. We should think also about social rewards and incentives. And peers have a very high social reward value during adolescence. Now, our first study of this was funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and we studied age differences in capabilities affecting judgment and decision-making. And this particular study involved over 900 individuals from 5 different parts of the country between the ages of 10 and 30. And it was a socioeconomically and ethnically diverse sample. Most important for purposes of understanding some of the findings is that the age groups were matched on gender and ethnicity and socioeconomic status and IQ. So to the extent that we find any age differences in the behaviors and capacities that we're looking at, they're not due to those demographic factors. They're not due to the fact that the groups were not equivalent in some way. So we looked at reward processing, sensation seeking, reward sensitivity, preference for immediate rewards, and sensation-seeking behavior, not just self-reported sensation-seeking, as well as measures of cognitive control. Impulse control, waiting before acting, anticipation of future consequences, and planning. We are now in the field replicating this study around the world with funding from the Jacobs Foundation. And I will give you just a little tease of what we're finding. We're not finished yet. This is a study in which we are assessing, again, people between the ages of 10 and 30, approximately 500 individuals in each of these countries. So let me first show you some of the findings on reward processing. So this is simply asking people to report on their own sensation-seeking preferences and behaviors. And what you see here is this inverted U-shaped curve that I mentioned before, that's similar to what we know about dopamine activity in the brain's reward centers. So you see this increase in sensation seeking that peaks sometime in mid-adolescence and then declines. And I'm not sure if I can speak for all of you, but just speaking for myself, I can tell you that as a grown-up adult, many of the things that I liked doing when I was a teenager just scare me to death right now. And that's because biologically, I have experienced this decline in sensation seeking that is normal to take place between mid-adolescence and into adulthood. So driving really fast, let's say down the highway, might have felt very good to you when you were 16 years old, but it doesn't, I can tell you, it doesn't feel very good when you're 60. This increase in sensation seeking sort of parallels this increase in people's preference for risk. So we administer questionnaires in which we ask people, how much do you think the benefits of this risky activity, and we ask about all sorts of them, unprotected sex is one of them, how do they compare with the risks? And so you see again this upside down U-shaped curve with an increase in people's attentiveness to the benefits of a risky behavior occurring during the first part of adolescence and then declining as they age into adulthood. Now I mentioned before that we study these phenomena not only using self-report measures, but using a series of computerized behavioral tasks as well, which turn out to be very important when you're doing cross-cultural studies because you're not always absolutely certain, even though we translate and back-translate our questionnaires, you're not always absolutely certain that an item means the same thing to people in different cultures, whereas these tasks have similar demand characteristics around the world. So imagine that I present you with 4 decks of cards, and I tell you that 2 of these decks are good decks and 2 of them are bad decks. And when you flip a card over from this deck, you're told something about the outcome, whether you've won points or lost points, and how many you've won or lost. And we do this in 3 sets of 40 cards. And we tell you that what we want you to do is to maximize your winnings by choosing from the correct decks. You know that 2 are good and 2 are bad, but you don't know which are which. So this is what it looks like. You see these 4 decks. You're asked if you want to play or pass on deck C in this instance. If you pass, the card doesn't flip over and you get no information at all. But if you play, the card turns over and you've been given some feedback about that card in that deck. And there's a running tally that's kept at the bottom of the screen. So you all get the basic idea here. And the bad decks have large gains, very, very large gains, but they have very large losses as well. And the good decks have small gains, but they have small losses. But the ratio of gain to loss in the bad decks and the good decks is rigged so that if you keep pulling from the bad decks, you will lose money over time, whereas if you keep pulling from the good decks, you will win money over time. Now, for those of you who like to gamble, it's kind of like playing blackjack. And when you hit a good deck in this, it's like hitting blackjack. You get a really big reward for that card. And even though you might know that playing blackjack over time is going to be a losing proposition, you might still enjoy doing it because of that feeling that you get when you win those big rewards. That's what the Iowa Gambling Task is measuring. And what we can do, because of the way that we designed the task, is we can separate out 2 different processes. Choosing good decks, which we think of as reward sensitivity, because you're paying attention to where the good decks' rewards are, or avoiding bad decks, which we think of as cost sensitivity. And so what we see here in this graph is that reward sensitivity, which is represented in the red bars, follows the same pattern that sensation seeking and risk preference follows. This is the change in pulls from good decks, red bars, or bad decks, yellow bars, over the 120 cards. Okay? And so if you have a bar that's below that midline, that means that people are choosing from that deck less often. So one good way to look at this graph is to start actually on the far right side. And what you see in the oldest groups is that their preference for good decks and their avoidance for bad decks is about equal, right? The red bars and the yellow bars are about the same size. But now look at the far left side of this figure. And what you see is that in the youngest groups, there's very little change in their avoidance of bad decks, but there's a lot of change in their approach to good decks. And other research suggests that adolescents are much more sensitive to reward than they are to punishment, which has important implications for parenting and for programming for adolescents as well. So we have analyzed a first cut of some of the data in our cross-national sample, and here's what we're seeing in these countries that are very, very different from the United States. A very similar pattern of, during the younger years, much more attention to reward than to cost, and as people get older, increased attention to cost, and this reward sensitivity seems to follow this inverted U-shaped pattern. This is consistent with our view that a lot of the reward sensitivity during adolescence is driven by the hormonal changes of puberty, and they're no different in Kenya or Jordan than they are in Italy or Sweden. And that's why we think we see a very similar pattern. We also measure reward sensitivity with a task that is called a delay discounting task. Now, so imagine I present you with an offer in which I ask you if you'd rather have $200 today or $1,000 in 6 months. And let's imagine that you say $1,000 in 6 months. Then I give you a new offer, which is, would you rather have $600 today or $1,000 in 6 months? And you still say $1,000. And I say, well, how about $800 today? And you say, yeah, I'll take the $800. And I'll say, well, how about 700? So you see what we do. We keep giving offers so that we drive people to what is called an indifference point, where the subjective value of the immediate reward doesn't feel any different than the subjective value of delayed reward. Everybody has an indifference point. And we do this with multiple trials where we vary the offers and with 6 different time intervals. And when individuals are willing to accept a lower amount to get it short term, it indicates a stronger need for short-term gratification, right? Because what they're saying is, I'll take less if I can get it sooner. And that is a definition of a need for short-term gratification. And what we see when we look at age differences in need for short-term gratification, that younger adolescents have a much lower indifference point than older adolescents and adults do. They have a much stronger preference for immediate rewards. One way in which we present these results is by showing something that economists call a discount rate, which is how much you discount the future compared to the present. And so if we graph the discount rate in our American sample, what we see is that younger individuals much more strongly discount the future. And that changes over time, especially between around age 12 and around age 16 or 17. And what we're seeing in the cross-national sample, despite the fact that these countries have very different currencies and very different economies, is a very similar pattern in discounting, with a big drop in discounting the future between ages 12 and 17. As I said, in very, very different parts of the world. So let me shift now and look and show you some of the data on cognitive control. The point of the data on reward processing is to drive home this idea that adolescence is a time when people are especially sensitive to reward and especially sensitive to immediate reward. And we see that in self-report measures as well as in these behavioral tasks. So if we start with cognitive control and just start with a simple measure, just asking people how much they control themselves, you see this gradual linear increase in cognitive control over time. Now what's important here is that this is a line, not an upside down U. It follows a different pattern, and it follows a pattern that is consistent with what we know about the maturation of the brain's cognitive control system, which is that it's gradual and it continues through adolescence and into adulthood. And note that there's continued improvements in impulse control during the decade of the 20s. It doesn't end at the end of adolescence. We measure this behaviorally with a task that's called the Tower of London. So I present you with this configuration of colored circles and 3 pegs, one that holds 3 balls, one that holds 2 of them, and one that holds 1. And I ask you to rearrange these using these pegs so that you've transformed this configuration from the start configuration to the goal configuration. And you do that by moving the balls back and forth among the pegs until you've reached the goal configuration. And I say to you that I would like you to do this in as few moves as possible. And the problems that I'm giving you are going to range in difficulty from ones that you can solve in 3 moves to ones that take 7 moves to solve. Now this is a task that is a good measure of planning, because you need to think ahead in order to solve the problem in the minimum number of moves. And if you make a bad first move, if you put that first ball onto the wrong peg, you're going to have to undo it. And you're not going to be able to solve the problem in the minimum number of moves. So one thing that we've been interested in is how long people wait before making their first move. And these are just beautiful data. We couldn't have made them up to look better than this. If you look at the red bars, that represents how much time people wait on the easiest problems before making their first move. And what you see is that there are no age differences in that. But now look at the green bars, which is how long people wait before making their first move on the harder problems. And you see a line that looks just like the line for self-reported impulse control, that people take more time to think out a strategy before making their first move on this problem. And what we're seeing in our cross-national sample is very, very similar. No age differences in the red bars, which is time before first move on the easy problems, but an increase in time before first move on the green bars. So we also think that there may be some biological basis for this improvement in self-control that may be universal during the adolescent and young adult years. This general idea has been replicated in an analysis that we did of a very, very large sample of Americans, which is the Children of the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, has 7,000 individuals in it, in which they administered self-report measures of sensation seeking, which is shown here in the dotted line, and impulse control, which is shown here in the solid line. And what you see is that in this very large scale, this is a representative sample of Americans of this age, that the sensation-seeking pattern is one that we're now familiar with, right? It's this inverted U, with a peak during middle adolescence, whereas impulse control takes place throughout this developmental period. I've put that red arrow there because we've done some analyses to ask, when is the gap between sensation-seeking and impulse control the widest? And it's here. It's around 14, 15 years old. I haven't shown you a graph that looks at this separately for males and females. Some of you probably are wondering about that. Females, this is probably no surprise to any of you women in here, but that females in general are more mature than males, especially during adolescence. Males catch up, but probably takes them till they're 70 or 80 or so to catch up. But the gap in sensation seeking and impulse control occurs at around the same age for females and for males. So this is a vulnerable period of time, right? If we think of the dotted line as the accelerator and the solid line as the brake, this is a vulnerable time for adolescent boys as well as adolescent girls. So let me just summarize this and move on to our research on peers. So we know now that the incentive processing system undergoes these important changes at puberty that lead to this temporary increase in reward seeking, and that this takes place against a backdrop of still maturing self-control. That's our accelerator and brake metaphor. And that therefore, mid-adolescence is a time of heightened sensation seeking and impulsivity, and this increases people's vulnerability to risk-taking. I'm not going to talk about it tonight, but this time period is the same time period of heightened vulnerability to many, many mental disorders as well. Adolescence is a very risky time, not just in terms of reckless behavior, but in terms of the onset of many serious psychological problems. And we see this basic pattern cross-culturally. It may be something that has to do with the hardwiring of what adolescence is as a developmental period. Now I want to show you some, I think, really exciting work that we're doing now on the role that peers play in this whole process. So I showed you those graphs before of adolescent risk-taking, criminal behavior, drownings, self-inflicted injury, and so on. What we know, if you look epidemiologically at this, is that adolescent risk-taking typically occurs in groups. So we know that most experimentation with alcohol and illicit drugs occurs with peers. We know that the risk of a serious automobile accident significantly increases with the presence of same-age passengers when you're an adolescent driver, but you don't see this effect if you look at adult drivers. So adult drivers do not have any more accidents when they are passengers in the car as they do when they're driving alone, but adolescent drivers do. And that if we look at crime data from the FBI, that adolescents are relatively more likely than adults to commit crimes in groups than by themselves. So risk-taking during adolescence is very, very often conducted in the presence of other same-age individuals. So why is this? Well, one possibility is that adolescents do everything with their peers. And so anything that you measure during adolescence, you would see is more likely to occur in groups than when people are by themselves. So how can we figure this out? Well, we designed a series of experiments to look at this in our lab. What we do is we have people come to the lab and we ask them to bring 2 friends of the same age and same sex. And then we randomly assign them to take this battery that I showed you, either by themselves or with their friends watching them. And we first started doing this with the friends in the same room as the subject, and then we moved to having the friends in an adjacent room where they could see the subject's performance on a monitor, and the subject knew when they were watching, because we wanted to go into the brain imaging environment, and it's really hard to cram all those people into the magnet at the same time. So in our first study of this, we gave people a video driving game. And what you see here is a comparison of how often people crashed the car when they were with their friends versus alone. And what you see here is really interesting. And this is, a laboratory experiment with random assignment to either being alone or with friends. So it's not just because adolescents spend time with friends, because we experimentally manipulated that. And you see that when people are alone, they don't take any more risks when they're adolescents as they do when they're college undergraduates or adults. But as soon as you put their friends in the room with them, you see this huge increase in crashing behavior among the adolescents, a small increase among the college students, and no increase at all among the adults. Now, you remember I showed you before our delay discounting task showing you that younger people had a stronger preference for immediate rewards, as evidenced by a lower indifference point. And these are graphs of the data that I showed you before, just picking out 2 age groups, 14 and 15-year-olds and the 18 to 21-year-olds. So we did an experiment in which we took college undergraduates, so kind of in the 18 to 21-year-old range, and we randomly assigned them to do that delay discounting test, $200 today, $1,000 in 6 months, to randomly assign them to take that task either with their friends watching them or by themselves. And what you find is that you can turn 18 to 20-year-olds into 14-year-olds by putting them in a room with other 18 to 20-year-olds. Okay? Now, this is interesting to us because this is not a risk-taking task. So what this shows us is that the presence of peers increases preference for immediate rewards during the adolescent years. We've recently replicated this using a virtual peer. So even if we just tell the students there's another Temple undergraduate down the hallway in a room who can see your performance on this task, we get the same effect, right? We get the very same effect. Just knowing that somebody that you haven't even met at this age is enough to change your preference for immediate rewards. This is one of our video driving games. So this game we developed to mimic a situation. How many of you drive? Most of you do. Okay, so you've all been in a situation where you're in a hurry to get someplace and you approach an intersection and the light turns yellow. How many of you have ever made a bad decision about what to do with that yellow light? Right, okay. That's what this game does. So we take people through a driving course, we incentivize them to do it as quickly as possible, and then we have them come to intersections where the light turns yellow just before they arrive at the intersection. And the only decision that they have to make is whether to brake or not. And we say, look, there's 3 things that can happen to you. You can brake at the intersection, and you'll lose some time while you wait for the stoplight to cycle back to green. And you see there's a very prominent clock there. There's a very loud ticking sound as well. You can go and run through the lights successfully, and you don't lose any time at all. Or you can crash, and you lose a great deal of time. So we administered this task inside the fMRI magnet. And again, we found that the presence of peers watching, now they're watching from an adjacent room, and they can't communicate with each other other than to say, hi, Kevin, I can see you now. That's all they're allowed to say. And it increases crashing among the adolescents, but it doesn't affect crashing behavior among the adults. We have done this with a gambling task in which we ask you whether you want to bet on this wheel landing on green, and where we calibrate the ratio of loss to reward. And what we find is that when adolescents are being watched by their friends, they take more risks, especially in the ambiguous situations and in the high-risk situations. So not only do peers increase risky behavior, they have a especially potent effect on adolescents' risky behavior in high-risk situations. This is from a sample of 15 and 16-year-olds. We've done this in a task in which you're simply guessing. We show you a pile of a potential reward. You're just going to guess whether the next card we flip over has an arrow pointing up or an arrow pointing down. That's it. Okay? And then we show you whether you've guessed successfully or not. And what we find is that when adolescents are given this task, when they're in a situation in which their friends are watching them and the potential for a reward is very large, it activates the reward circuitry in their brain. Okay? So we've now begun to understand the neural underpinnings of the effect of peers on adolescent risky behavior. It activates the incentive processing system, and that makes us pursue risky choices. So why is this happening? What's going on? Well, remember I said, well, maybe it's that they just do everything more in groups, but we've ruled that out because of our experimental design. Well, maybe they just put pressure on each other to do risky things. Well, we've ruled that out by putting them in the other room and also by having tasks in which there's no risk involved, where it's just a reward processing task. We stop them from communicating with each other. So it can't be that they're explicitly putting pressure on each other to take risks. That doesn't explain it either. So the most common explanation that we've given for this finding is that even if their friends aren't explicitly pressuring them, they're trying to impress or to please their friends. They're thinking, this is what my friends want me to do. So we thought, okay, let's do this study in a sample using adolescents who are not capable of thinking about what their friends want them to do. So we did it with mice. Now remember that I said before that all mammals go through puberty, so we can use other animals to model human adolescence. So what we did was we created peer groups of mice. They were weaned, and then they were grouped with 2 other mice from different litters, and they grew up with these little friends in the cage. And then we took half of the mice and we tested them as adolescents, and half of them we waited until they were adults. We know how many days it takes to become pubertal mice. And just as in our human experiments, in each of these age groups, we tested half of them alone and half of them with their friends in the cage with them. The test was how much alcohol would they drink if given unlimited access to it. So what we found is that adolescent mice drink more alcohol when they're with their friends than when they're by themselves, but adult mice do not show any differences in alcohol consumption when they're alone versus with other mice. We've done a second experiment and found the exact same results and have replicated this. And this again goes to the idea that there may be something evolutionarily adaptive about this risk-taking, reward-seeking increase that takes place during adolescence. And it's due to time they spend drinking. It's not just due to the fact that they're more active when other mice are in the cage. So let me just summarize this and conclude my talk. That the heightened value of peers increases reward sensitivity during adolescence, and that this accentuates the imbalance between these brain systems, and it increases the chances of people taking risks. And that the impact of peers on reward sensitivity may be a hardwired feature of adolescence. After all, if the goal of adolescence is to reproduce, who do we want you to feel good around? People your own age, right? So this, we think, is evolutionarily adaptive. So let me just very briefly list a few implications for policy and practice. So if risk-taking is an inherent feature of adolescence, what's the appropriate public health policy? Classroom-based health education, for the most part, doesn't work. It doesn't work because the problem that adolescents have is not that their information is deficient or that they don't think well. It has to do with other things that these classroom programs don't address. So maybe we should try to change the context in which adolescents live rather than trying to change adolescents away from what they are maybe destined to be. I've been interested in legal and social policy. If adolescents are different from adults in these ways, should we hold them to adult standards of culpability? Should we give them the same privileges as adults? What are the implications for adolescents' health care decisions in the absence of adults? So I know I've gone over a lot of information very quickly. All of our scientific publications are posted on my website at Temple University. They're all available for downloading. And so if you're interested in looking at some of the specifics of these experiments, I encourage you to go there and to download your heart out. So thank you very much. And I believe that we have a time for a couple of questions. There are mics that are set up in each aisle, so if you have a question, please use the microphone. Yes, sir.
Interesting thing this morning on NPR, they were talking about the study of adolescent deaths, auto deaths.
Yes.
And Washington has laws that restrict you from driving with peers for a couple of years.
Yes.
And it came out we had one death this year. And they attributed it to our laws being different because the trend is up in most states and our state is even, such as that.
Yes, so the gentleman's pointed out that graduated driver's licensing programs, as like you have here in Washington State, have been shown to work. Washington is not the only state that has it, but states that do have graduated licensing in which adolescents are not permitted to drive with other adolescent passengers until they're a certain age or have a certain amount of driving experience have significantly lowered crash rates. I will compare that with driver education, which has absolutely no impact at all on crash rates among adolescents. So this is an example of what I mean by changing the context rather than trying to change the adolescent. Question?
Oh, thank you. I was wondering if you had any ideas about the effect of contraceptive birth control on the developing brains and the risk, any of the
The question is
adolescent.
whether I know anything about the effect of birth control pills, I assume, on developing brains. I know nothing at all, and you know, I follow the adolescent literature pretty closely. I've never seen a single study of it. So, but presumably, you know, if the pubertal hormones are affecting brain development, then somehow tweaking those hormones could have downstream effects on the brain. So it's quite plausible that they might.
Yeah, I think it's quite a worry because on the one hand, it's great that these kids are smart enough not to get pregnant, but on the other hand, if they're starting birth control pills at the age of 16 or so and being on birth control pills for a long time when the brain is developing.
Right. The one caveat I would pose, and then I think we'll just take one more question, is that most of the effects of pubertal hormones on the brain are taking place much earlier than age 16, and it may be the case that those reward systems are not as susceptible to external influence at the age when most young women who take the birth control pill start taking it. One final question.
So I've been thinking about the implications of what you're saying as a parent of an adolescent.
Yeah.
And I had kind of two ideas. One strategy would be to not let my kids have any friends.
Yeah.
But maybe a more practical one would be to try and set up a situation where you give them the opportunity to be exposed to manageable risks, you know, rather than just let them go out there and find their own risks that might kill them or, you know, maim them or whatever. Is that, do they see through that, or is that actually a useful strategy?
So the question is, given this and given the peer findings, what's the advice we can give parents? And clearly, I agree with your intuition that it's probably not a good idea to not let your teenager have friends. Not that you could do it anyway if you wanted to. But I think you're absolutely right that the answer to this is to monitor and supervise the situations in which your teenager is with friends. So I'm always very surprised at parents who will let their teenagers drive with 5 other teenagers in the car, but would never let their teenagers drive if they'd been drinking, even though it turns out that driving with 5 other teenagers in the car is just as risky, if not more risky, than driving after you've been drinking. So the question is getting this information out to parents so that they can provide more effective management, let's say, and supervision of their adolescents' time with peers. Thank you. Thank you again.